I am really excited that we have this topic to talk about this year. This is an important topic. As most of you know, understanding oxygen chemistry and how it interacts with wine is very important through the entire wine's life, from the beginning until the end. It changes how we're going to treat oxygen, how we're going to encourage it to interact with our wine or not. We have a very special speaker here today to talk about this topic, and so it is with great pleasure that I introduce winemaker Clark Smith. Clark is not only a winemaker of Winesmith Wines, he is also the author of Postmodern Winemaking. If you haven't read it, read it, it's great. Clark is also an international wine consultant, an avid wine judge, and he is a teacher of wine-related topics, wine chemistry at an assortment of colleges and universities. So we're so lucky to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming Clark to the Oregon Wine Symposium.
Dr. Evil greets you. It's 45 minutes. We're going to pack a lot in here, and so prepare to drink from a fire hose. I'm going to mostly concentrate on Pinot Noir. My early remarks will just be about phenolic chemistry in general, and then I'll talk about Pinot Noir, which is the exception to everything, except I believe that Argon Pinot Noir is the exception to the exception. So let's just get started, and I can't, I really can't, I guess your samples are covered, but we won't be tasting them for a little while. So if you want to tap into them, that's fine, but try to keep them covered because partly I want to show the reduction that's happening in one of the samples and so forth. So you don't want to breathe them too much. And we can't really get too far without talking about the M word. I really wrote the book to encourage honesty. And I don't think that we've really had an honest conversation with wine lovers for 30 years. So I'm not going to spend very much time on this, but the simple truth is that all wine is highly manipulated. Those aren't grapes in the glass, so get over yourself. However, no wine is as manipulated as any beer, and nobody ever gives brewers any shit about manipulation. So look, there's no money in this business. There's no one in this room that's stupid enough to think that they can make any money in the wine business. And all you have really is the love of the product and your honor and your connection to people. It's what draws people. It's the reason that I'm in the business, because I just love all you guys. I just think it's so cool to actually be able to fill a room with fiscal morons. But we sell our honor cheap. We say we do the minimum, and then we go out and we sweat our butts off 24/7. And so what I'm saying is, don't engage in any practices that you're not willing to brag about. And then you should brag about what you do. You shouldn't go tell people you do the minimum. I mean, if you want to be a lying sack of shit, be a doctor or a lawyer. At least you get the Porsche. So Don Fraser, I was talking to him about this, and he said, Clark, the only moral high ground is telling the truth. And I hope you'll take that to heart. So that's the end of my speech on that. I was asked to talk about the 4 ways of making white wine. I don't have time for that. I got 45 minutes, so I'm sending you the article. And I do think it's an important way to parse the problem of white wine making. Bear in mind that the wines, we have Adolf Hitler to thank for the wines that we make today. If it wasn't for him scaring the pants off of every scientist in the West, we wouldn't have ever split the atom, we wouldn't have had nuclear, we wouldn't have bubble pointable sterile filters, we wouldn't have sweet table wine. We'd still be making port and sherry. But the way wine was made prior to World War II is an interesting thing to study. Both the Muscadet sur Lie, wines that use tannin and are intended for long aging, and also, in the extreme, the oldest winemaking that began in the Republic of Georgia, the so-called orange wines or clay jar wines. So that's what that's about. It's a great article, but I'm not going to talk about it. So here's what I am going to do. I'll present to you a model that was derived from my work with Inadev in France, Patrick Ducournau, who developed enological oxygen uses and some other things, and a whole model of wine having a structure, that wine is not a chemical solution, and its deviation from ideal solution chemistry is really the source of quality. Then I'm going to talk about why, what I call the Pinot Noir train wreck, and some ways out. I'll clarify the terminology of the 6 different ways we can bring oxygen to wine and their purposes. And then I'm going to talk about, for the first time, we finally have some methodology for measuring reductive strength and oxygen appetite, and that's kind of new and I think very important. Oregon Pinot Noir, in my opinion, varies more in its reductive strength than any other wine. And I think it's really important for you to be able to put a number on just what you're dealing with wine to wine. Okay, so I didn't know whether to put this stuff in, but just some little baby steps here. A phenolic is simply a benzene ring that has an OH on it. And so we have this whole class of compounds that are derived from just hanging stuff off that ring. A flavonoid is a 3-ring circus from skins and seeds that has that structure. We'll get into the chicken wire a little bit more later, but that's the basic idea. A monomer is a discrete single, if you like, a Lego that we use to build a structure. And then as it dimerizes and polymerizes, we're just tacking together a bunch of monomers, and I'll be using that terminology. Tannin is a polyphenol that has an affinity for protein, particularly salivary protein, that cooperatively binds to polymer but not monomer. Now, this Chapter 6 in my book is completely dedicated to this reaction that was developed, elucidated by Vern Singleton in 1987, and it's called the Vicinal Diphenyl Cascade. And, you know, I hesitated to put that chapter in the book, but I just think this reaction is so crazy and so central to winemaking that it's absolutely essential for you to have a handle on it. Note that the side product is hydrogen peroxide, and this is the engine of polymerization. This is from Singleton's paper. You'll notice that the diphenol, up in the top left there, that double OH, is recreated at the end of the reaction. So that means that it can cascade, and it can react over and over again, and in fact becomes more and more reactive as it polymerizes, which means that oxidative polymerization is homeopathic. That the wine, what happens is the pKa's on the dissociation of phenolate get lower. So we start at 9 and move our way to 8.5 or so, and that means the compound is more and more reactive as it polymerizes. So it's kind of counterintuitive that if we properly challenge a wine with oxygen when it's very young, we can actually increase its reductive strength and its ability to protect itself against oxygen. So stressing the importance of monomeric color, an anthocyanin is just one of those flavonoids that has the property that it absorbs it at 520, which means that it's red. Anthocyanins are critical to red wine texture and longevity, and the reason is, well, I'll get to that in a second. First, I want to point out that the flavilium ion is the one that's red, and it's got a pKa of about 2.6, so it's only red below 2.6, and that means a very small fraction of it is actually colored in wine, and it's mostly invisible as a monomer. Once it polymerizes, then it doesn't ionize anymore. So here's a graph of one of the predominant malvidin-3 glucoside ionization. I'm showing it in water and in 13% alcohol. And you can see that at a wine pH that almost none of it is colored. And so you may very well have a wine that looks like it's really got color problems when in fact a lot of it is colored, but it simply hasn't seen enough oxygen to polymerize and to stabilize that color. Now, it's a particular problem in Pinot Noir because the anthocyanins are more vulnerable. I'll explain that in a second. This is a Peinidin versus Malvin, and you can see that you don't ever really know exactly what the mix of the 5 anthocyanins is, and that means there's really no way to estimate how much color that you have if you're looking at the wine at pH, say 3.6, which is what the Summers assay does. It's the most well-known assay. And so I'm a big fan of the Adams assay, which looks at high and low pH at the anthocyanin. You can see by difference that you can get a pretty good handle, pH 5 versus pH 2, on what Doug calls the bleachable pigment, the monomeric anthocyanin. And then below that, you have a baseline of polymer. The goal is to polymerize everything rapidly so that you can stabilize it all before you lose it. So here's an example. This is a 2015 Pinot Noir. On the right is pH 3.6, and on the left is 2.5, and you can see maybe 3/4 of the color of that wine is invisible. And that's a neat little test for you to do. You don't really need any fancy equipment to look and see whether or not your oxidative polymerization has begun to complete itself. And I'm not going to talk too much about lees, but you need to wait until the monomer is converted before you start stirring your lees, or you're going to lose your color. So what you see is not what you get. They're also subject to bisulfite bleaching, and I'm sure the first time you ever added SO2 to your Pinot, you had a heart attack and died. Remember that? Okay, now here's a little bit more about the structures. I just want you to see that in the top right there, that what that is a catechin or an epicatechin, and you have right here the vicinal diphenyl structure, so that's where the polymerization comes from. Over here, this is an anthocyanin, it doesn't have that structure, and so what that means is that it's a terminal unit on the polymer. That means that the more color we have, the shorter our polymers are, and the less cooperative binding, the finer the texture, and the more surface area we have between the colloids that form, the phenolic colloids, and the aqueous system around them, which gives you more aromatic integration. I'm going to say that again, but that's the basic logic. So if polymerization is happening and an anthocyanin comes along, that terminates the polymer, and in non-oxidative polymerization, it has this regular 4-position, 8-position, 4-8, 4-8, 4-8, and it ends up being a collapsed molecule like that doesn't have very much body. So we're going to talk about an alternative to that where we use oxygen to do the polymerization and we end up with a different structure. Same composition, different structure. So the bottom line is if we have a poor color to tannin ratio where we have lots of catechins and not very much color, which is typical in Pinot Noir, then we can get more and more polymerization even in the bottle over time, and more cooperative binding, coarser, drier tannins that are endemic to Pinot Noir and poor longevity. But if we can come in early and capture good, rich anthocyanins that we've been able to create in the vineyard through balanced vine work in the vineyard, then we can end up with these little, this is kind of the ideal, something that's about 7 units long. Uh-oh, I think I hit the wrong button. Oh, good. That's tannins on the inside, and then anthocyanins on either end, either polymerized, as I've shown, or aldehyde bridged. That's another way that we can tack on those anthocyanins. In this form, they're stable, they won't precipitate out, they'll be fully colored, they're not subject to attack by enzymes, and they form these fine colloids. So the bad news about these monomeric anthocyanins is that, first of all, they're nearly insoluble in 13% alcohol. A rosé is about the best you can do. So in red wine, the color and the tannin are not in solution. They're in these little colloid beads. Mostly invisible, vulnerable to attack by enzymes, particularly Pinot Noir, and to oxidation, and they also bind SO2. So why is that a big deal? Well, this is a paper which I wish had gotten more play. In 1999, Alain Lanvaux-Funel at the University of Bordeaux did an experiment where she showed that pigment-bound SO2 is not effective against Acetobacter. It will inhibit malolactic, and so we think that it's effective against bacteria, but it doesn't inhibit Acetobacter. And so the combination of the poor reductive strength we often have in Pinot and the binding of SO2 and the low temperatures that we have in Oregon cellars is a formula for VA. So what's protecting red wine? If pigment-bound SO2 doesn't inhibit Acetobacter, what is keeping all our wines from going to vinegar? And the answer is reductive strength. And so we need to be able to measure that and promote it. Oxygenation is a way that we can use the reductive strength of a wine to build a structure and increase its resistance to oxidation. So that would look something like this. If we bring in oxygen, we're activating that B ring, and it'll go off and sort of randomly attack another phenol. So now we start to get this you get that free rotation, and we end up with this more complex open molecule that has more interactivity with salivary protein so that we gain body even though we have the same composition. And so instead of that compact little molecule that I showed you before, we end up with something that looks more like this, and it's much more open and interactive. Now, one of the ways that we can measure reductive strength is with a Warburg Flask. This was developed in France, and some of you knew Pascal Ribeiro-Guéant. His father, Jean-Michel, was also the director of the University of Bordeaux, and he developed this in 1933, but nobody's ever done anything with it. And it's a real simple test where you take 140 mils of wine, and then you add some sodium hydroxide flake. You can use drain cleaner, seal it up, and just stick it in a controlled environment like a cellar and let it go for 24 hours. And it's going to pull a vacuum. And you can use that to measure the reductive strength of wine. So here's an example of an experiment we did on Pinot in the Russian River out in Annapolis, right by the ocean, some pretty reductive Pinots. And we brought oxygen, the top line. In other words, the one with the more reductive strength is the one that we micro-oxygenated early on. So it's an example of being able to increase reductive strength by bringing oxygen. So then the other interesting news is that SO2 itself actually inhibits this reaction by an order of magnitude. So this is Andy Waterhouse. Oh, darn it. Sorry. Okay, let me see if I can do this. Up here's the diphenol, and it reacts with oxygen and makes this quinone intermediate, which is then going to polymerize. But if you have SO2 present, it takes it right back to the original diphenol. It short circuits the reaction, and that happens according to Andy, 92% of the time. And so we're taking away the wine's ability to react with oxygen by an order of magnitude. Here's a Petit Syrah that I wanted to see how many saturations it would take, and so we just kept shaking the bottle up every day, and then it would gobble it all up, and we'd do it again. This is a wine that had a reductive strength of 14 parts per million per day. But the interesting part of this graph is right here in the beginning, that's just 1 milligram per liter per day, until the peroxide gobbles up all the SO2, and then all of a sudden it plunges and it changes from 1 milligram per liter per day to 14 milligrams per liter per day, and it kept that up for 80 saturations. So I do a lot of experimenting with sulfite-free wines, and I don't have oxidation problems. I have reduction problems because of this. They just don't behave like conventional wines because they have much more capability to protect themselves from oxygen. Okay, so Pinot. So then there's Pinot. And there's a lot of reasons why Pinot is a challenge. As you know, it has low anthocyanin content, and it also is very delicate, and so a lot of the strategies that we can use on Bordeaux varieties don't work very well on Pinot. In particular, its tendency to have dry tannins anyway means that we really can't bring supplements or even blend other varieties without sort of ruining the delicate sort of hollow, seductive nature of the wine. And it's also very low in cofactor content, and so the little bit of anthocyanins that we do have are very difficult to extract. So what am I talking about? Well, if you're doing an alcoholic fermentation, this is just like a typical alcohol curve, sort of the inversion of the Brix curve, if you like. If you look at the total phenols, say A280 absorbance, you're going to get this knee-shaped curve where the bottom part is monomer and skins, and then up here you're starting to get the seeds out and more polymer. But that isn't what the anthocyanin curve looks like. The anthocyanin curve looks like this. After about 3 days, if you go in and run your 520s or your bleachable pigments, you're going to see those anthocyanins drop out as soon as you start to get some alcohol. And the reason is that they just aren't very soluble. So what you got to do is build these copigmentation colloids. And there's a wonderful summary paper by Roger Bolton about just how these things work. The bottom line is it's a 1-to-1 anthocyanin to cofactor ratio, and they have to be monomer. So you're not going to be able to use a bag tannin or any kind of polymer to stabilize your color. The exception to that is the sacrificial tannin, where you can go in early on and use it to pull out the protein that might be attacking your native cofactor. But it doesn't directly participate in the colloid. Now, this is an unstable sort of temporary colloid. It's not the kind of colloid that's going to remain in the wine. We've got to tack all of those pieces together with oxygen in order to stabilize the form. But this is how we get it out. And in Cabernet Franc or Sangiovese, I love to use untoasted allié chips from Inadev. It's wonderful in helping extract, but those don't really work very well in Pinot Noir because they tend to dominate the flavors, and other kinds of adjuncts are really hard. So we developed this methodology to achieve basically that, to maintain our color. And what we started doing was ultra-filtering press wine from sparkling production of Pinot Noir and also Pinot Gris. So an ultrafilter is a cross-flow filter that's sort of halfway between a clarifying filter and an RO. And say around 25,000 molecular weight. And what happens is we get basically free run through for the first 95% of the run, and then we get this stuff we call cofactor concentrate. So if we were to look at just the absorbance at 280 flavonoid, non-flavonoid. You can see that all the cofactors, all the stuff that's building that's building the colloids comes out right at the end when all the colloids sort of merge together into a tar. Just want to check my time here. Okay, so that's a pretty cool trick. And I think you guys could cooperate with each other about using your hard-pressed Pinot Noir. You really just want to squeeze the snot out of it, and then you'll get a rich harvest of cofactor that can really improve. You have to add it during fermentation, and then working with sparkling wine producers as well. That's what we've been doing in California. Really good results. Okay, so another problem with Pinot Noir is that the pigments are not acylated. So what am I talking about? An anthocyanin has a glucose hanging off of it right here, and in all other varieties, it has an acetic acid, basically, that's esterified onto the glucose. And the reason is that it sterically hinders the active site of a lot of the enzymes. Of course, you know, there's lots of enzymes that want to go after a glucose, but they don't work on most anthocyanins. Pinot Noir doesn't have acylated pigments, so that glucose is just hanging out there, and so it's much more vulnerable to attack. It's really kind of a tragic situation that you don't have very much anthocyanin, and what you've got is really vulnerable. And of course, it doesn't clarify itself because it doesn't have very much tannin, so that means that your yeast are suspended. You know, I was kind of horrified the first time Ducournau told me that I needed to centrifuge my Pinot Noir, but it really does help to somehow get that stuff to fall clear as quickly as you can. And if you don't, you're going to lose a lot of color. Fragile, prone to oxidation, and low in structural aromatic integration. Now, what do I mean by that? So a white wine, a Sauvignon Blanc or a Riesling, its job is to take the terpenes and esters and all the flowers and fruit, and those are not particularly water soluble, and so it's the wine's job to push them up into the aromatics. And that's how unstructured wines work. They're basically solution chemistry. But red wines already have all kinds of stuff happening up there, different kinds of fruits and chocolate and nuts and all that. And then on top of that, we'll introduce barrel constituents and vegetal characteristics and microbial stuff, and you end up with this big mess. The last thing you want is for that wine to strongly express all these elements. Instead, we want a lot of these things are phenolic rings. 4-ethylphenol, the pyrazines they have a nitrogen in the ring, but it's still a ring. A lot of the vanillin, a lot of the barrel constituents, guaiacol, are all phenolics, and so they can be intercalated into these colloids if we have a real fine colloid in a lot of surface area. And so the idea with a good colloidal structure is that we can pull all those things down and integrate them together so that we end up with the fruit being in the center of the wine. And that's the logic of aromatic integration. Allow your wines to handle a lot more microbial activity, and so I think in general it's useful to look at a wine through the lens not of the composition but of the structure. And then finally, here and in Burgundy, you're really up against the problem that your cellars are often too cold. This is an empirical thing from Ducournau's work, that diphenol reaction is second order, and so the temperature dependence is squared, and that means what we've found is that 59 to 65 is the ideal place for oxidative polymerization, and it's when the wine is showing the most reduction. Take a look at down here around 50, you only have maybe 25% of the reductive strength. remember that was what was keeping the oxygen away from your acetobacter, right? So if you're down around 50 degrees in the cellar with a relatively feeble Pinot Noir in the first place, you're opening the door to acetobacter, and acetobacter likes it just fine down there at 50. Okay, so now I'll address the topic of my talk. The term microoxygenation gets thrown around in a lot of improper contexts, so I just want to clarify just the language of the 6 ways we can bring oxygen. The first we call hyperoxidation, and that I understand there's a lot of that going on here, often in white wines where we're pulling out the browning constituents in aromatic varieties and trying to protect our terpenes and give a light, delicate structure. This is common practice in the Mosel to end up with wines that don't produce peroxide and don't oxidize and can age a long time. That's hyperox. Macrooxygenation is oxygenation during fermentation. It has essentially no effect on phenolic polymerization because the yeast activity is so strong that it's pretty much going to gobble up all the oxygen. But it is really good to keep your fermentation from sticking. So then for microox, we have 3 phases that we define, and the wine is dropping by an order of magnitude throughout the phases. So phase 1, and here we're talking about post-fermentation, so there's no activity, best when the wine is clarified, so that we have a slow introduction that's below the consumption rate that the wine can take up, below its oxygen appetite. Phase 1, the day of dryness, even a really light Pinot Noir can take 10 or 20 times what a barrel can give it. I'm using here the mils per liter per month, and that's essentially pretty close to a barrel equivalent of, a big Napa Cab will take 100 times what a barrel can give it for 3 to 6 weeks. And that's when we're really stabilizing our color and building structure. Phase 2 happens post-malolactic, post-SO2, so the SO2 is dropping the reactivity by an order of magnitude, and we'll be typically running at 2 to 8 mils per liter per month. Some of you are using parsec units, and all you have to do is multiply all these numbers by 1.42 to get you milligrams per liter per month. And then phase 3 is mostly when we're bringing the wine out of barrels being built sort of inside out from the way we really like them to be. Wouldn't it be great if the raw wood was right on the surface and the toast was buried inside the stave so that we could get, very slowly get more and more toast, but that all the raw wood was coming out right when it could be resolved over time. But that's not what happens. What happens is just about the time we're ready to bottle, we're starting to extract that pithy raw wood. And so often it's best, the wine no longer can consume all the oxygen that's coming in from the barrel skin, so we have to bottle, but we have this pithy tannin. So we might go in with a fraction of a barrel equivalent in stainless to give the wine a kind of a haircut before we go in. We also might do this if we have a wine that has too much reductive strength. We're going in under a screw cap, and we know we're going to seal that wine up and it's going to get reductive, and so we can quench the wine a little bit with oxygen just before we bottle. Usually takes about a couple of months to do that. And then finally there's cliquage, which is violent oxygen. You could be racking, you're putting in 1.5 parts per million of oxygen or something like that, and the idea there is not to build structure, but to break the structure, move the wine along. This is, all over Burgundy and Bordeaux, they're doing cliquage, the week before Parker shows up. And its purpose is to open up the flavors and move the wine along. It's the opposite of slow and low. Like the difference between stir frying versus being in a slow cooker. All right, so let's concentrate a little on just the micro oxygenation part. And I guess this would be an okay time to taste these wines. This is a Hyperox trial. It is phase 1, but it's a late phase 1 trial on an Oregon Pinot 2015, where we saw some coarseness and some reduction, and we wanted to resolve that. And while you're tasting those, you've got the control on the left and the treated wine on the right. So what are the sources of reductive strength? Well, we've been talking about the Vicinal Diphenyl Cascade, and that's certainly part of it. And it's dependent on the concentration of compounds in the berry, of course. Field oxidation, how excessive hang time can rob the wine of its strength. Our extraction strategies we talked about, its early exposure to oxygen, the cellar temperature, and this decline during aging. Stirring lees can add to reductive strength, some glutathione in there. And then this mineral buzz in the finish seems to be coming from limestone or decomposed granite or some other soils like schists. We don't know what it is, but we know that it adds to reduction. And then there's some other stuff in Pinot Noir that we don't understand at all. So what we've been doing is using a NomoSense unit to look at a dot that's glued on the inside of a bottle and then measuring the dissolved oxygen over time so that when we get a rapid decline in oxygen, we know we've got a reductive wine, and if the curve is sort of flat over time, then we have a fragile wine that we have to take care of. These are the observed ranges. Sauvignon Blanc, you'll see that these vary 15, 20-fold. Sauvignon Blanc, some of them will take 6 months to gobble up a saturation. We're going to get down to some Petit Syrahs that do it twice a day. Chardonnay is a little bit more because of the oak tannin. But Pinot Noir has a huge range. It can be as feeble as a Sauvignon Blanc, or it can be as tough as a big Cabernet. So this is what they look like. Now here's my crucible. This is my big Napa Cabernet, and it's pulling, this is the 2005, so it's pulling about 1 milligram per liter per day, about a part per million per day. That's great. That's doing pretty good for a 2005. But now I have this wimpy little Fiddlesticks Pinot, also 2005, and it's pulling 1 milligram per liter per day too. And you can read a magazine right through this stuff. So there's something really mysterious in Pinot Noir that we don't know how to measure. So what I'm telling you is if you think you can tell on a Pinot what its reductive strength is by looking at it and tasting it, I gotta tell you, you're a better man than I am. I can't do it. Okay, so the wines we're tasting, what we did was to micro-ox them at a relatively low level, 0.7 milligrams per day. That's about 15 mils per month. And that turned out to be a little too much. We were building dissolved oxygen, did that for 7 days, and we cut it down to 8.5 mils for 5 days, and that's the whole treatment. And I think you'll agree that we refined the mouthfeel, opened up the aromatics, eliminated the reduction, and we had the effect of reducing the oxygen appetite from 0.36 to 0.28. So here's the control. You can see that's the number, 0.36, with a pretty darn good R squared. And then here's the treatment. So we were able to measure that we got that down in an area that was a little closer to what we wanted to get close to bottling. So it depends on where you are in the curve. In the early going, when we're building structure, we're going to get more and more reductive, and then we get over the hump and we can start to quench the wine. While that's happening, we'll see a reduction in fermentation aromas, and then we'll see the varietal aromas coming up. I must caution you that if you get into this phase and you get to where the wine is tasting really good here and it's nice and soft, you need to stop. You know, because more is not better at this point, and there will be a point at which you'll drive off a cliff here, and you'll end up getting into the oxidative phase. It's very important to avoid that. So think ahead. Now, finally, I want to just touch on argon. There's a paper that you can read, and it isn't just really about argon. It's about how to use inert gas, and the main thing is just measure what you're doing, for heaven's sake. But the two take-home messages, one is what we're doing is we're up at the top of the tank with a hose in the bottom, so if we can layer it in real gently, then we don't see any oxygen for a while, and then it starts to drop. The faster we put it in, the more argon we have to use, because this is turbulent flow and this is laminar flow, and so we can actually, with about 1.5 volumes, we can completely gas that tank. And the other thing is to use as large a diameter hose as you possibly can. Here I'm showing that 1/4-inch hose, that we always, that everybody uses. Not only does it take 1,000,000 years to get it in, but you'll have to use 3 or 4 volumes. You might as well just use nitrogen if you're going to try to put argon in with a 1/4-inch hose. So just the last 10 feet or so, go to a 2-inch hose, put a T on the end, and then you can put it in laminar. It's much faster and much more effective, and you use less gas. So take-home messages: figure out a cofactor strategy of some kind. Measure your reductive strength. I think it's the most important thing you can be doing, regardless of what techniques you're going to employ. Master at least the language of the different ways of using oxygen, and then start to play around with them. I think your wines will amaze you. And I do think some, not all, but some Oregon Pinot Noirs are some of the wines that can benefit the most from this. Not the fragile ones, but wines like this that have some coarseness and a lot of balls, that there is a benefit here and there. And finally, really think around your cellar temperature. I'm just going to touch on the idea that besides the VA issues, there's other forms of microbial equilibrium that you can foster in the cellar, and that's really what the next talk is about. So I thank you very much. I'm going to be available for questions out in the lobby after the second talk.